the making of a target. Basically, that's what we're going to call it. This is the making of a target. So no one was looking at me as someone who was a victim of any kind of abuse, and I certainly didn't think I was abused. The story was that we were perfect. I had a perfect family. In fact, I had superior parents. They weren't just good enough. They were better than everybody else's parents, because my parents were competitive and they had to be, better than everybody else. And they had every narcissistic trait. They were judgmental and they looked down on other people, and they were, and they definitely fed each other, and we fed them. And my moment in the sun was right when I was born. And I think that, and my mother would always say that she loved newborns. And it was the same sort of thing with in nursing, that she loved really sick people, too sick to make her feel that she was in a service position. She could technically do the technical stuff of taking care of someone that was super sick, but she didn't want to be anyone's beck and call girl, that's for sure. And so I think that classic narcissistic thing was my mother would, and she would all this she would admit. She talked about this all the time. That's how I knew it. How much she loved newborns, and definitely the story that she recounted most often about my life was the day I was born. That was the most of the nice stories that she would tell were all around when I was a brand new baby. And there aren't a lot of these great stories past that. Private moments. There wasn't a lot of I don't remember being held or read stories or played with, that kind of thing. I was well dressed. I had dance classes. My parents always showed up for recitals and graduations and awards nights and all that. They were always there for that. I always had a beautiful prom dress, and I had a wonderful wedding and all that stuff. In fact, I even my next video is going to be after I met my husband, but I'll interject this in case I forget. But I remember at my wedding, planning the wedding, I asked my mother if I could just have a small wedding and then have the money that was left over to maybe put down on a house. And she said, no, if I'm going to spend the money, I want to have a party. So it was like totally about her. And she invited, most of the guest list were people I didn't know. In my childhood, I saw my parents have no problem abandoning people. There was I mentioned this in other videos, but outside of my bedroom we had this hallway of photos, and it was like my parents' wedding photos and graduations and like when I was baptized and different things like that. And all the people, like their wedding party, my godparents, I didn't know them. They were completely out of our lives by the time those pictures were hanging there. And so it was a graveyard of relationships that had been just left behind. And I was curious about that. I thought it was kind of weird, and then I actually saw them do it. So this is where I think I can kind of help out with sort of explaining the difference between narcissists and sociopaths, because the narcissists are not necessarily the ones that are the chameleons playing to the room and all that. The sociopath, who I'm going to talk about in the next piece, definitely is. They were fine to just ditch people. They could just ditch. My dad ditched his the best friend, who was also his first cousin, a lifelong friend, just ditched him. And I used to always think, God, something huge must have happened, although I never knew what it was. And now, I don't think necessarily anything huge had to have happened. Maybe it did, but I did absolutely nothing to them, and they ditched me. So, and their grandsons. So, I don't think all that I needed to do was need them. That's all I needed to do. And their friends, when they ditched them, also were going through divorces, were like maybe realizing they had an alcohol problem, were depressed. They were going through a hard time, and that's when they ditched them. So they just couldn't go there. They just couldn't go there emotionally. So I grew up I went out into the world thinking I was overly sensitive. I was taxing, my emotions were taxing on people, that I was, I was flawed, and having really no understanding of what I was entitled to, like what I deserved in a relationship, because I was always giving more than I was getting back, and that was how I thought love was. Even my oldest friend, a friend I had in preschool, and when we were in high school in this small little town, he came out that he was gay, and he was worried I was going to, turn on him, and I wouldn't even ever considered turning on him, and so I didn't. And even when he told me that he was HIV positive and he was moving from Los Angeles, we lived in Los Angeles then, moving back home, and I wanted to go back home too to be with him. I wasn't going to turn on him, and he'd been accidentally overdosed a couple of times on drugs. He got really involved with crystal meth. This is a friend. It came time for me to need him. He totally just ditched me without even a word. So I realized that I had not only parents that were narcissists, but I had actually, my oldest friend even was. And I say that I had this perfect childhood. I think a perfect family. I never went through anything. I'm surrounded by grandparents, thank God. My grandparents saved me. That's one thing that my life on the outside of my house is very, very stable. And actually, because I think narcissists can't handle a lot of uncertainty. They need things to be certain and sure. So that's part of the reason that. So my parents stayed together. We stayed in one house. They stayed at their jobs. Nothing changed. And I had my grandparents around and all that. So it all seemed really, really perfect. And I interpreted all the things. I made cause and effect meanings, associations that everyone would. Like that my parents lived near their parents and had kids in this small town because they're family-oriented people. And that my family had always typically, everyone would graduate from high school and then go off to college, go off to travel, go off to military, whatever it was, go off for a little while, have their adventures, and then come back and settle down near family and start having kids in their middle 20s around home. So when I went off to college, when my parents very much encouraged my brother and I to go away, far away to college. And I thought that was this huge, that meant they loved us even better than other parents because they weren't clinging to us. I was thinking to myself, that has to be very hard because all parents have an empty nest syndrome and they don't want their kids to leave. And I'm sure that they're not even guilting us. They're not even saying, oh, we hope you come back. They're not even doing anything like that. They're just saying, they're just taking their chances. So, I went down to Los Angeles, and a couple years after college, I'm in a relationship it's an emotionally abusive relationship with a narcissistic man. And I can see that it's not going anywhere. I still have my wits about me at this point. I can see that it's not going anywhere. And it's starting to bother me. I'm starting to feel really pulled back home because my friend told me that he was HIV positive and that he was going home because his family his family wanted to help him. They wanted to get him the best medical care and all that stuff, and his family rallied around him, and he was going home. And another girlfriend that had come down, and she was my roommate, had come down. She was thinking she wanted to go back home where she could have family support with my friend, and it was starting to make me realize I didn't remember my childhood. And I have this, I have this perfect family, and I actually think that I have a happier family, a better family than almost everybody because. My friends had divorced parents, and they had stepdads, and most of my friends didn't have good relationships with their moms, and their dads were either gone or had died, or And I didn't have any of that. I didn't have any of that. So anything that I thought was wrong, didn't blame him. But I felt this pull to go home, and I really wanted to be near my grandparents before they were gone. I wanted to spend their last years with them. So I went home, and practically immediately, I knew something was wrong. Because one of the first things I did is I asked my mom if she had any idea why I couldn't remember anything. And if she could help me remember things. I didn't know her. See, this is the thing. I didn't know her. I didn't know them because I couldn't remember them before I was 15. And then the part that I remembered, it was just a couple of years. And in those couple of years, we were living like 4 separate people. It was like, this traumatic thing happened to me when I was 15, and sexual assault happened when I was 15. And I told my brother about it. My brother insisted I tell my mother about it, and my mother said, this is what she did. She's like, just like this. Okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're never gonna mention this again, not even to your father. And I went, okay. And we didn't. And I knew that she blamed me. I knew, implied that that I had brought it on myself. I was, it was my fault. And my mother didn't want to hear about it again, so we didn't mention it again. There was no protectiveness at all. No concern, nothing. No follow-up at all. We never did mention it again. But that's where my memory started, strangely enough. So actually, because of that, I didn't think that the other memory was missing because of trauma, because the first thing I remembered was a trauma. So I thought the thing that I remembered was the worst thing that ever happened. And all the stories that I had felt like memories, and they were happy. And as my memory started coming back, I started remembering was because that's when I could start remembering my life without it conflicting with the story. Because at 15, I was driving, and then I was working, and I had dance classes and friends and stuff like that. So it was all the things I was remembering were away from my family, and so it didn't have to conflict with the story that we were this happy family. And before, when I was younger and I was dependent and needing my mother and my father to take care of my needs and to nurture me and to tell me that I was beloved and adored and make me feel safe, that didn't happen, so I couldn't remember it. Anyway, this is the scenario. So I come back home, and I'm now 24 years old, college graduate, worked a couple years in Los Angeles, had this bad relationship, and came back home to be near family. I decided I was going to settle down near the people that I loved, in the one place in the world where love was supposed to be guaranteed, around my family.